On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
Today, I'd like to welcome to the podcast Dr. Mark Collins. He's the Chief Innovation Officer at Helomics, a division of predictive oncology. He possesses a passion for applying science to build high-tech life science products and services that impact the search for new medicines. He maintains he's had one good idea, that computers and especially AI can help the search for new medicines, and he spent a 20-year career trying to make that a reality. Mark feels that Helomics is uniquely positioned to deliver on this goal. With an outstanding multidisciplinary team, Helomics is pioneering the development of AI-driven models of tumor drug response and outcomes that will enable lower cost, faster, and smarter discovery of new therapies, as well as help clinicians individualize cancer treatment with current therapies. Born in the UK, Mark has a global perspective gained in Europe and the USA at startups, biotechnology, and pharmaceutical companies, government research labs, and as a co-founder of 3 companies in the drug discovery, artificial intelligence, and software space. When he's not being a science geek, Mark likes to ride bicycles fast, play the guitar slowly, and loves to cook and be outdoors. All right, and so today I'd like to welcome to the podcast Dr. Mark Collins. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Don. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful, and you?
Very well, very well. It's Friday after all.
That's right. It sure is. So, Mark, you have a very interesting career. Given that you've worked around the world and you have a lot of different perspectives, if you wouldn't mind, just share with us a little bit about your career and then also what kind of led you to being an entrepreneur in the end.
Sure, yeah. So I think every kid that grew up in the 60s and early 70s, I wanted to be an astronaut. But to be an astronaut, you had to, like in the UK anyway, you had to go into the Army or the Air Force, and I didn't really want to do that. So I took the next best thing. My uncle was a kidney surgeon, and I was always inspired by him. And unfortunately, I didn't get good enough grades to go to medical school because I spent too much time playing music. And so I ended up studying microbiology, which, again, is a very worthwhile thing to do. And that led me through various careers to a PhD on looking for novel drugs, for novel antibiotics, in fact, and then on into the pharma industry and various startups, where I was either, looking for drugs or, pretty much looking for drugs, initially against infectious diseases, and then when I was with Boehringer on anti-cancers. So I think, I guess my experiences have always been, I couldn't be a doctor. How could I help in other ways? So for me, designing the next generation of drugs, in the case, which is my time in the pharmaceutical industry, then with Helomics here in Pittsburgh, really focusing in on the best kinds of tools to aid drug discoverers find drugs. Those are things that kind of drove me. I think the entrepreneurship is also a bit of a family thing. My family has an engineering company in the UK, and my uncle ran that company. He was a classic sort of entrepreneur, though they probably didn't call them entrepreneurs at the time, but he was always enthusiastic, always trying new businesses, always trying to come up with new ways to build engineering, find solutions for really quite complex engineering problems. So I got a lot of my entrepreneurship from him, I think. And throughout my career, I had opportunities when I worked on my own and when I wanted to, as it were, strike out on my own, because either it was a lifestyle thing, or it was I really feel passionate about this and I can't do it where I am inside this company. So the next best thing is go and build your own company and do it yourself.
There you go.
And that's how I really made the transition, I think, from what might be termed bench science to much more of the software and eventually AI side of things. I found that was interesting, but I thought if I really should want to do them properly, then I'd probably better put my money where my mouth is and actually go and do them.
So then what led you to artificial intelligence of all things? What kind of created that from microbiology, that transition?
The true microbiology to artificial intelligence, yeah. A little bit of a leap, but I was always interested in computers. I did a minor in mathematics and computing, my degree, and I used computational methods in my PhD, and then in my first job, I was given the task of coming up with ways to grow very novel microorganisms. Couldn't do those, all for real in the wet lab. We developed some computer algorithms to be able to simulate growth, and that put me on the track to looking at different ways of analyzing data. And when I had my own company in the mid 90s, I was just doing general software for pharma companies, and I happened to go to a trade show and saw this company that was selling basically artificial neural network software. That's what we called the stuff then. And I was intrigued by it and thought it was being used for credit scoring and insurance risk assessment and stuff like that. And I thought, those problems aren't that dissimilar to discovering drugs. When you're discovering drugs, you're trying to come up with a risk assessment. You're trying to make a prediction about something. I got to believe they could be applied in the pharma industry. And this company, we think the same, but we don't have any domain expertise. Would you come and work for us? And so I went to work for them, and we did a lot of really interesting projects in AI, in drug discovery, and happened to end up writing a short paper that was published in Nature Communications it's called Empiricism Strikes Back. I'm a classic science fiction nerd. And it was really all about how taking an empirical approach driven by artificial neural networks, AI, we might be able to discover drugs faster, cheaper, better than we were doing it at the time. And that caused, I didn't say cause, but that led me in the end to Boehringer Ingelheim, where I really developed that approach in tandem with drug discovery for anti-cancers, in fact. So that's how I got into AI. Serendipity, like most things.
The drug discovery pathway it's one thing that's difficult enough. You start with 10,000 different ways that the molecules could be applied, that continue filtering down so you get to human trials eventually. But there's a long way to get to actually the point that you could touch a human. And now that I hear your story about AI, it's almost like you've applied a little bit of that same sort of methodology to get to where you are as well.
Yeah. I think I've been through a couple of companies. I left Boehringer Ingelheim because they didn't really want to pursue that approach very much. So again, I left Boehringer with a colleague of mine who was very experienced in drug discovery, and we built a company up together to essentially use high-throughput screening data, the sort of nuts and bolts data that most pharma companies are generating, in order to build a model that would predict activity at a particular kind of target. We were pretty successful at doing that, and along the way, we developed some other sort of side algorithms that were interesting, and that's how I ended up in the States, actually, as a US company here in Pittsburgh. Bought that company we set up in AI and drug discovery in the UK, and I came here in 2001.
That's fantastic. It's a fantastic story and tells the overall journey. So tell me a little bit more about Helomics. So what are you focused on? What are you guys really working on there?
Yeah, so Helomics has been around in Pittsburgh anyway, about 20 years too. So as long as I've been here and I was aware of it, it was called Precision Therapeutics before it was called Helomics. And the premise of Helomics was chemo response testing. The idea that the best way, perhaps one of the best ways to find out if the patient will respond to a chemotherapy agent is to test it on the patient's own tumor. You can't test it on them going to get the therapy anyway, but wouldn't it be a great idea if you knew that their tumor would actually respond to it, even if that response was in the lab, in a petri dish, if you will. And that was the premise. It was developed as a spin out of the University of Pittsburgh here, and the guy that developed it, a guy called Paul Kornbluth, Dr. Paul Kornbluth, was a medical doctor, spent time at the NIH, established actually a lot of the cell lines at the NIH that we now use for drug discovery and drug testing, and just thought that it could be applied clinically. And that's what he essentially did, built the company up, proved that it would work, that the result in the lab was predictive of the result in man, or in this case, woman, in the case of ovarian cancer. So they had a clinically validated, essentially patient-derived tumor testing platform validated for ovarian cancer as a way to decide from the panel of standard of care drugs what would be the best drug to give the patient to put them on the path to recovery, or at least a longer lifespan. And particularly in the case of ovarian, there aren't any good biomarkers. We don't have biomarkers like BRCA1 and BRCA2 and HER2 and HER positive and so on, and ER positive like we do in breast cancer. We don't really have those good biomarkers. So although the classical therapies for ovarian, the platinum-based drugs, are very effective, some people just don't respond, some people respond and then recur, and some people just keep chronically recurring and responding. And being able to sort that out early on in that patient's treatment was very important, and it did have a positive clinical impact in that most patients whose oncologists took the recommendation from the lab testing were really able to live longer and have better outcomes even when they recurred too. So it was a pretty thought out and well built out company. Fortunately, got into a little bit of trouble through hubris. The business ran away from the science, and then I came on board about 3 years ago to take what had already been built, take this foundation, and see if we couldn't apply it, not just clinically, but apply it to discover new drugs or to repurpose old drugs using a combination of historical data they'd amassed. We've amassed here the drug responses of 150,000 tumors, which is that's the world's largest, and I'm not being modest, it is the world's largest collection of drug response data. So actual response of a patient tumor in the lab to drugs. That historical data is just an absolute gold mine for drug discovery and biomarker discovery, and all the things that go along from knowing how a tumor is, but a real tumor, not an immortalized cell line, not a xenograft in a mouse, but a real tumor to different drugs. So we thought that we could take that data, take the platform that we currently have that we use every day to help oncologists for ovarian cancer, sprinkle in a bit of AI and be able to really build extremely powerful clinical decision support systems, but also extremely powerful ways to accelerate and improve the search for new anti-cancers. So that's what we've been doing for the last 3 years.
So it sounds like you almost have two separate customer bases. So I'm going to start with one and then maybe go to the second one, because we talked a little bit about the pharma side, so I'll come back to them for a second. But this idea of working with the oncologist really sounds almost like you're supporting the tumor board actions.
Yeah.
Can you just tell me a little bit more about what that looks like? Because I've heard these stories. I haven't been a part of a tumor board before. I've heard they've got to compile all this information. They go in and there's big conversations that happen, and I guess I envision that this magical sort of thing happening with AI being involved there and guiding that sort of conversation and decision process. Is that how it goes, or tell me a little more?
Yeah, on the clinical side, a test that we currently have, that is part of the information. So we generate both, we call it functional tumor profile, the response of that tumor to drugs. We're also looking at the mutations in that tumor as well, and we're providing all that information back to the clinician to either make a decision based on that information or to go to their tumor board where this information is part of that. In the future, let me just deal with it here and now. Even before we send that information out to the clinician, we have compared that patient's result with the historical results for those kinds of patients. So already the information that the oncologist is getting is informed by thousands of patients that have gone before. Even absent any AI, right. It's just basic like patient reference populations, for want of a better word. But that is huge, right?
Yeah.
Even if you're the most experienced oncologist, how many patients do you see in a year? We've seen 35,000 ovarian cancer patients, for want of a better word, or at least we've seen their tumors and how they respond to drugs. And we can deliver that kind of knowledge back to the clinician in even without the power of AI. With the power of AI, we can do a lot of really interesting things, because then we can bring together all the information that a traditional tumor board would throw into the mix, the genomics, the transcriptomics, some of the histology on the tumor, some of the clinical demographic information about the patient, together with the drug response and so on. And with the power of AI, weave that together to, again, give a much more actionable, that synthesize all the data together, which is what AI is really good at. It finds patterns that we humans can't find. And so we think in the future, once we've validated the AI approach for the clinical test, then that'll make that clinical test less of a test and more of a sort of clinical decision support, a AI-based, as you put it, tumor board, which encapsulates the information from thousands and thousands of patients, not just that one patient, which is what normally happens.
Yeah, and I mean, just to be able to save one patient from having to go through all of the experimentation that it would take to get to the permutations to get them to a point where you're delivering something that benefits them. Self-driving cars are cool for artificial intelligence. Self-driving cancer treatment that gets you to that end point a little quicker, maybe a little bit less pain, or surviving it. Any one of the three would be tremendous for the patient. So.
That's right. And I think certainly going back to what drives me, the passion to help people and find some ways to move the needle for each individual patient. The reality is that cancer treatment is still somewhat medieval. And I might offend a few people by saying that, but it is. If you get ovarian cancer, and there's surgery that goes on that's pretty drastic, right?
Yeah.
And then you're flooding your body with extremely toxic agents that you don't know whether they'll work or not. Anything that we can do to improve that, to me, seems worth doing. And I think that I've always had this belief that computers and computational methods in general can augment what we can do as humans. AI is never going to replace the oncologist, but you can make that oncologist like a superhero, right. Give that oncologist like superpowers in order to be able to really move the needle for that patient. Because, like I said, no matter how good that oncologist is, they can't know everything, all the different subtleties and so on. And they can't increasingly synthesize together all these different data streams that they're getting bombarded with.
Yeah, it's just got to be a tremendous amount of data, even that they have to know at the basic level to be able to do what they do. And to pay tribute to them, they absolutely have to know an awful lot at the base level.
Oh,
but now, to your point, right, what if this next tool gives you the ability to really have an impact on patients, which is probably why they got into medicine and in the area of medicine that they're in anyway. The oncologist life of treating patients is not an easy one, let me put it that way, I would think. So I'm going to switch sides just for a second. So from a pharmaceutical standpoint, so are you helping then the pharmaceutical companies see where there might be benefits for other molecules that they would go after, or how does AI help that side then?
Yeah, the reality of pharmaceutical discovery, as you're probably aware, is that it's often we're trying to search through a massive space of chemicals, potential new drugs, to see if they have activity at the target that we're interested in, and then we take that on into man and so on. Reality is that most drugs fail. They fail for one of two reasons: toxicity or efficacy, and so what we believe we can do, with a combination of all of this historical data about how real tumors respond to drugs, the ability to test compounds, potential new drug candidates, in a living tumor model, opposed to a traditional sort of cell line or receptor assay or something like that, with the power of AI to make predictive models, we can really inform drug discovery in a way that you could never have done it before. Because most of the public data is data from cell lines. It doesn't have most of the public data is the response of that cell line to a drug, a potency measure. Whereas what we have and have access to is outcome data. We know how that patient did on that drug, how long they lived. And where we don't have it, we know we have the ability to access it if we don't have it already. So we're doing a couple of studies actually with a hospital here in Pittsburgh, where we're actually going back, looking at drug response data, sequencing to get mutations and gene expression from the tumor, and then we have what drug the patient was treated with and what the outcome was. So that means we can build models that predictive models that can screen in silico inside a computer millions of combinations of drugs to see if they will influence outcome. And then instead of, and this is some technology that we actually licensed from Carnegie Mellon University just recently, that allows us to combine that with the laboratory test and really just do this in a sort of end-to-end, like an engine. We can we do a little bit of experimentation. So instead of screening 1 million compounds in the lab, we screen a few compounds. In our case, we're lucky because we got all that data already. Then we go ahead and we add that data to our predictive model. We run a simulation, if you will, a virtual screen inside the computer of millions and millions of combinations. And what the AI does is it says, I think you should go and look in this area. So we then go in the lab, we maybe test another 50 compounds, right? In our live tumor assay, feed that information back into the AI. It does this thing called adaptive learning, and then eventually narrows down to a few potential drug candidates without having to screen millions of compounds in an assay that's not relevant. It's a cell line. We can screen, because it's a low number of things we're testing, we can screen those in live tumors. So we think that's really has the potential to revolutionize the way that drug discovery is done by using historical data that's from patients, by using simulation coupled to AI, and by marrying that with tumor relevant, patient relevant way of testing these drugs. So we should have a much better chance of those therapeutic candidate drugs being high quality, because they have, they're informed by historical data, and they've been through, as it were, a patient relevant testing platform from which we have some data from. So that's what we think we can do. We're, so far, the companies I've spoken to don't think we're crazy, which is good. And I think that we're really poised, to make some real inroads into the way that the drug discovery is done. It still is a lot like shaking trees and hoping for the best. And that's, I think, that there are other companies trying to do this. We think our approach, which combines together this real-world data, if you will, on patients, should give us a more holistic approach to it, rather than perhaps trying to dock a molecule with the 3D structure of the protein or the target or something like that.
Sure. It definitely sounds transformational for the drug discovery side as well. I know I've definitely seen, working all the way, through all of the HPLCs, trying to get down to the molecule that you want to have, eventually growing that molecule and making it into a drug. But it's a very long process for anybody that hasn't lived through it. So I have three last questions for you, and then we'll finish up the interview here. The first one is, what inspires you, Mark?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think we're all inspired by stories. I think what inspires me is the benefits that science can bring. I think whenever you see a good story about how science has done something positive for mankind, I think that's what inspires me to do that. I always think that every problem can be solved. You just need enough time, enough persistence to do it. So I guess I'm inspired by positive stories of how science. So those were the things that inspired me to become a scientist. Is look at all the things that we can do if we just understand and we're just curious about the natural world, as it were.
And what concerns you? What sort of keeps you up at night?
Oh. Apart from how I'm going to get my son through medical school, I would say that we're doing all that we can to move the needle for patients, and make sure that we get to the point where we've delivered something that makes a difference. There's always a strive for perfection, but I think over the years I've realized that getting something out there that even moves the needle 60% or 70% is better than not getting anything out there at all. So that was what keeps me up at night is, are we good enough? Do we have all that we need? And can we quickly make an impact on patients? And am I sometimes overthinking these things?
The perfect answer as to how your concerns certainly center around the patient and the impact. Last question. So what excites you? What really makes you want to jump out of the bed in the morning and do what you do?
I think it's coming here. I've always been thankful for the fact that I get to do something. I get to be paid to do something that I really enjoy. And that's the case here. But I think even more of the case here is everybody here really has always had a focus on an understanding of what we do impacts patients. The clinical test that we have running today impacts ovarian cancer patients every day. And that's just fantastic. And then the opportunity to take that and work with an incredible team here, incredibly diverse viewpoints and cultures and so on, and deliver something that's going to even enhance that even more, I think is just an incredible privilege. And I'm incredibly, privileged and honored to be able to be a part of this thing. I'm not an expert in anything by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that articulating a vision with people is important, and having those people agree with that vision, and then them get out of bed every morning excited to come into work and make something happen, even when it's perhaps not. We're frustrated. We didn't get the data that we wanted. We didn't quite get the result we wanted. We got to go back and take another look. There's just this sort of sense of purpose, I think, that gets not just me, but everybody here at Helomics out of bed in the morning and ready to do something fun, to do something important and have some fun doing it.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be with me and to be a part of the podcast here. I greatly appreciate your time, and thanks so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, and the podcast series is successful.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.